Galactic Empire shaved hair of 3 human girls. Unaware humans will declare all-out war. The planet Kesvarn was a quiet place. It had thin blue skies, soft green hills, and small rivers that moved slowly through wide valleys. Humans had built a small colony there many years ago. It was not a rich colony. It did not have tall towers or strong armies. It was a place where a few thousand people lived simple lives, growing food, studying local plants, and trading with nearby worlds. The colony was part of a peace agreement between Earth and a large alien power, called the Threxian Empire. The Threxians were an old and proud species. They had ruled over hundreds of star systems for more than 1,000 years. They were tall, with gray skin and long fingers, and they moved with slow, careful steps, as if every step needed approval from someone above them. Their empire was built on rules, ranks, and order. Everyone had a place, and everyone stayed in that place. Humans, in the eyes of the Threxians, were a new and small species. They had only joined galactic society a short time ago. Threxian records called humans young, unstable, and unimportant. Most Threxian officers had never even met a human in person. They only knew what old reports said, and those reports claimed humans were weak, soft, and easy to control. This is where the story begins. On a cold morning, 3 young human girls were walking back from the river near the colony. Their names were Mia, Sarah, and Priya. Mia was 18 years old, tall and quiet, with short brown hair she always tied back before working outside. Sarah was 17, loud and quick to laugh, with long golden hair her mother used to braid every morning, before she passed away 2 years earlier. Priya was the youngest at 16, calm and thoughtful, with black hair that reached down to her waist. She had never cut it in her whole life. Her grandmother used to say that hair carried memory, and Priya believed her. The 3 girls were close friends. They had grown up together on Kesvarn, going to the same small school, working the same fields, and dreaming the same dreams. Traveling to other planets one day, seeing Earth, which none of them had ever visited, and maybe studying at a real university among the stars. That morning, they were stopped by a Threxian patrol. The patrol was small, just 4 soldiers and 1 officer, riding in a gray hover vehicle that floated a few feet above the ground. The officer's name was Vex Doran, a mid-level commander sent to Kesvarn to check on compliance issues. The Empire had recently updated its laws about biological registration, meaning every non-Threxian citizen needed a new scan of their body, including hair samples, for something called the Universal Genetic Archive. It was a boring, routine task for the Threxians. To them, it meant nothing more than paperwork, but when the patrol stopped the 3 girls, something went wrong. Vex Doran looked at his datapad and frowned. "These 3 are not in the registry," he said. "No biometric record, no hair sample, no scan." One of the soldiers, a younger Threxian named Skreth, stepped forward. "Sir, human hair samples were supposed to be collected last cycle. It seems this was missed." Vex Doran sighed, the way someone sighs when tired of small problems. "Then we will collect them now." Mia stepped forward, trying to explain. "We didn't know about this. No one told us. If you give us the paperwork, we can come to the office tomorrow and—" "That is not necessary," Vex Doran said, cutting her off. "The process is simple. It will only take a moment." He said this the way someone might say they were going to check a temperature. To him, it was nothing important. He did not think about what it might mean to a human girl. He did not think about her feelings at all. The soldiers moved quickly. They did not ask again. They did not wait for permission. Sarah tried to step back, but a soldier held her arm, not violently, but firmly, the way someone might hold a piece of equipment they were fixing. "Please," Priya said, her voice shaking. "Not like this. Please, just let us go to the office." But Vex Doran was not listening. He had already lost interest in the conversation. To him, this was simply a task to finish before lunch. One by one, the 3 girls were held in place while a small device, a fast humming clipper, was used to shave their heads. It took only a few minutes for each girl. The soldiers were not cruel on purpose. They were not laughing or mocking anyone. They were simply doing their job, the way someone removes a label from a product. There was no anger in their actions, but there was also no care. Mia's short hair fell to the ground first. She stood still, her jaw tight, refusing to let herself cry in front of the soldiers. Sarah cried quietly. thinking of her mother's hands braiding her hair every morning, now gone in seconds under a Threxian blade. Priya said nothing at all. She only closed her eyes as her long black hair, the hair her grandmother said carried memory, fell around her feet like dark water. When it was done, Vexdoran looked at the three girls, now bald, standing in the cold morning light, and simply nodded, satisfied the task was finished. Biometric collection complete, he said into his communicator, proceeding to next location. The hover vehicle rose into the air and moved away, leaving the three girls standing alone by the river, their hair scattered on the ground around them. None of the soldiers noticed a small security drone that had been recording the entire event. It was an old colony drone, used to watch wildlife near the river, forgotten by everyone except its automatic recording system. It had captured everything: the stop, the girls' pleas, the shaving, and the officers' calm indifference. That night, the drone's footage was uploaded, as it always was, to the colony's public data network for review. A young data technician named Alex, who worked the night shift, noticed the file by accident while checking system logs. He almost ignored it, but something made him open it. He watched in silence as the recording played. He watched Vexdoran's calm face. He watched the girls shaking hands. He watched their hair fall to the ground. Alex sat back in his chair, feeling something cold settle in his chest. He did not know exactly what this meant yet, but he knew it was wrong. He knew people needed to see it. Within an hour, the video had been sent through the colony's communication relay to Earth. It traveled through several relay stations, passing through systems and networks, until it reached the offices of the United Earth Defense Council, the organization responsible for protecting human colonies across the galaxy. At first, only a few officials saw it, then a few more. Then it was shown to senior officers, and finally to the council itself. No one on Earth had expected anything like this. Humans had lived alongside other species for only a few decades. There had been small disagreements before, trade disputes, border arguments, diplomatic misunderstandings, but nothing like this. Nothing where human civilians, young girls, were treated like objects to be processed, without asking, without respect, without even being seen as people. The Threxian Empire had made a very small decision that morning. To them, shaving 3 human girls' heads was nothing more than paperwork, a biometric formality, forgotten within the hour. They had no idea that, on the other side of the galaxy, millions of humans were about to see that same video. They had no idea what it would mean to a species that valued personal choice, dignity, and the right to say no. They had no idea that this small, careless act would become the spark that lit a fire across human space, a fire that would not go out until the Empire itself had changed forever. For now, though, none of that had happened yet. For now, there were only 3 girls standing quietly by a river, their hair gone, their hearts heavy, not knowing that their pain had already begun traveling across the stars, reaching people who would soon decide that this could never be allowed to happen again. Mia was the first to move. She knelt down and picked up a small piece of her own hair from the ground, holding it gently in her palm, as if she could somehow give it meaning again. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at her friends. "They didn't even ask," she whispered. "They didn't even look at us like we were people." Priya said nothing. She simply looked toward the sky, toward the stars where Earth was, wondering if anyone out there would ever know what had happened here. By the next morning, the video had already reached far beyond the Defense Council. Someone inside the council's staff, angry and unable to stay silent, leaked the footage to a public news channel. Within hours, it was everywhere. Every home screen on Earth showed the same images: 3 young girls, held by soldiers, their hair falling to the ground, while an alien officer stood by, bored and indifferent. People across Earth reacted in ways the Threxians could never have predicted. Parents held their own children a little tighter that night. Teachers stopped their lessons to show students the news. Soldiers who had served for years without ever firing a weapon in anger found themselves staring at their own daughters, sisters, and nieces, imagining them in the same position. It was not simply anger. It was something deeper, something that touched a very old and very human fear. The fear of being treated as less than human, of being controlled without consent, of being made to feel small and powerless in front of someone who did not even see you as a person. The Threxian Empire believed this event was small. They believed it would be forgotten in a matter of days, the way most diplomatic incidents were forgotten. They had made this same mistake before with other species. species that argued, complained, and then quietly accepted the situation because they had no other choice. But they did not understand humans. They did not understand that humans did not measure insults by size. They measured them by meaning. And to humans, what had happened to Mia, Sarah, and Priya was not a small mistake. It was an act of disrespect that could not be forgiven with an apology or a formal letter. Somewhere far away, in a quiet office on Earth, a senior officer named General Elena Cross sat alone, watching the video for the 5th time. Her hands were folded tightly on her desk, and her eyes did not move from the screen. When the video ended, she said nothing for a long time. Then she picked up her communicator and made a single call. "Prepare a full briefing for the council," she said quietly. "Tell them this is not a diplomatic matter anymore." Far across the galaxy, in a cold Threxian command center, Vex Doran filed his routine report, marked the task as complete, and moved on to the next item on his schedule, never once imagining that his small, forgotten act by a quiet river would soon be remembered as the first spark of the greatest war humanity had ever fought. 3 days after the incident at Kesvarn, the video had already reached every major human colony and every home on Earth. It had been translated into dozens of languages, shared across every network, and watched by billions of people. Yet across the vast territory of the Threxian Empire, almost no one had heard of it at all. This was the first mistake the Empire made. Not the shaving itself, though that was bad enough, but the complete lack of attention given to it afterward. In the capital of the Threxian Empire, a massive city built from black stone and glowing towers called Threx Prime, the daily reports from outer colonies were reviewed by an enormous bureaucracy. Thousands of officials read thousands of reports every single day. Most reports were simple: trade numbers, mining output, minor disputes between local governors. The report from Kesvarn, filed by Vex Doran, was one of thousands that day. It read simply: biometric registration completed for 3 unregistered human subjects. No resistance beyond verbal objection. Task completed within standard time. No further action required. The official who reviewed this report, a mid-ranking administrator named Threll Cade, read it in under 10 seconds before stamping it as resolved and moving to the next file. He did not think twice about it. To him, and to almost everyone in the Empire's massive government, human hair meant nothing. Threxians themselves did not grow hair at all. Their entire species had smooth, gray skin from birth to death. The idea that hair could carry emotional meaning to another species had simply never occurred to them. It was not written anywhere in their historical records. It was not part of their culture. It was, quite literally, invisible to their way of thinking. This blindness was not unique to Threll Cade. It existed throughout the entire empire, from the lowest clerks to the highest members of the ruling council. The Threxian Empire had ruled for 1,000 years by treating every conquered or allied species the same way, through order, structure, and control. Species that objected to Threxian rules were simply reminded of the consequences of rebellion, and most species, having seen the size of the Threxian fleet, quietly obeyed. Humans were new. Humans had only been part of galactic society for less than 50 years. The Empire had barely studied them. What little the Empire knew came from outdated reports written decades earlier by explorers who had only briefly visited Earth before humans developed real space travel. Those reports described humans as emotionally volatile but militarily weak, a species with limited technological development and no history of large-scale interstellar conflict. Based on this outdated information, the Threxian ruling council believed there was nothing to worry about. Even when a young analyst named Terran noticed unusual activity in human news networks and brought it to the attention of his supervisor, he was told to file it under civilian unrest, minor, and move on to more important matters. "They are a young species," his supervisor said, waving a hand dismissively. "They complain loudly, but they do not act. Humans have never fought a war beyond their own solar system. They do not have the strength or the will." Meanwhile, on Earth, something very different was happening. The United Earth Defense Council held an emergency session only 4 days after the video was first released. It was one of the largest meetings in the Council's history. Every seat in the chamber was filled, and thousands of officials watched remotely from colonies across human space. General Elena Cross stood at the podium. She was not a woman who raised her voice often, but when she spoke, the room went completely silent. 3 young women, she began, were stopped without warning, without explanation, and without consent. They were physically restrained. Their hair, a part of their body, their identity, and in many cultures a symbol of dignity and personal choice, was forcibly removed by armed soldiers of a foreign empire. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act, carried out calmly and without hesitation, by an empire that considers human beings beneath their notice. She paused, letting her words settle over the room. We must ask ourselves what this event truly represents. It is not simply a matter of hair. It is a matter of what this empire believes it is allowed to do to us, without asking, without warning, and without consequence. Several council members shifted uncomfortably. A few even looked confused. One senior diplomat, a cautious man named Ambassador Reyes, raised his hand. General, with respect, this was a single incident, involving 3 civilians. Should we not seek diplomatic resolution before considering anything more serious? General Cross looked at him directly. Ambassador, if a stranger walked into your home and shaved your daughter's head without asking, would you seek a diplomatic resolution, or would you demand justice? The room fell silent again. It was not only the council that felt this way. Across Earth, ordinary people were reacting in ways that surprised even seasoned political analysts. Protests were not organized by any government. They rose naturally, spontaneously, in cities across every continent. People gathered outside government buildings holding signs with the words, "Dignity is not negotiable, and we do not forget." Veterans who had never spoken publicly about their service began giving interviews, comparing the incident to historical atrocities from Earth's own painful past, times when people were stripped of their identity, their hair, their names, and their humanity by those who saw them as lesser beings. For many people on Earth, this was not simply about 3 girls on a distant colony. It touched something ancient in human memory, a collective fear of being dehumanized, of being treated as an object rather than a person. This emotional reaction confused many alien observers who happened to be present on Earth at the time, including a small group of neutral diplomats from other species allied loosely with the Threxian Empire. One such diplomat, a Velkari trade representative named Onu Ves, sent an urgent message back to his home government. The humans are reacting far beyond what is logical for this event, he wrote. Their emotional response appears disproportionate to the physical harm caused. However, I strongly recommend the Empire take this seriously. I have observed something in human behavior that I have not seen in any other species, an emotional trigger tied not to survival, but to something they call dignity. I believe the Empire underestimates how deeply this concept runs in their culture. His message was sent to Threxian intelligence services, but like so many other warnings, it was filed away under minor cultural notes and largely ignored. Back on Earth, the diplomatic response from the Threxian Empire finally arrived, 5 days after the video's release. It was a short formal statement issued through their embassy. The Threxian Empire acknowledges the biometric registration process conducted on Kesvarn. All procedures followed standard imperial protocol. No violation of law or treaty occurred. The Empire regrets any discomfort experienced by the individuals involved, but does not consider further action necessary. The statement was meant to close the matter quietly, the way thousands of minor diplomatic issues had been closed before. Instead, it had the opposite effect. When the statement was read publicly during a press briefing, there was a long silence in the room before a single reporter asked, "That's it? That's the entire response?" The Threxian ambassador on Earth, a calm and experienced diplomat named Sarah Lannock, appeared confused by the reaction. In a private meeting later that day with General Cross, he tried to explain the Empire's position. "I understand this is a sensitive matter for your people," he said, "but I must ask you to understand our perspective as well. Biometric registration is standard procedure across the entire Empire. Every species undergoes this process. It was not intended as an insult." General Cross studied him carefully. "Ambassador, do Threxian citizens undergo forced removal of a physical trait unique to their identity as part of this registration?" Sarah Lannock paused. "Threxians do not have hair," he said simply. "There is nothing equivalent to remove." "Exactly," Cross replied. "You removed something from us that has no equal meaning in your own culture, without understanding what it meant in ours. And your Empire's response to being told this was to call it a formality." Sarah Lanok, to his credit, seemed to understand the weight of her words, but he had no authority to change the Empire's official position. He could only report back to his superiors what he had witnessed and hope that someone above him would take it seriously. Unfortunately, back on Threx Prime, the ruling council had already moved on to other matters. The Empire was dealing with a border dispute involving a much larger, more established species, called the Corveth Dominion, a power the Threxians considered a genuine military threat. Compared to that, the human situation seemed insignificant, a minor irritation from a young, weak species that would eventually calm down and accept the Empire's authority, as every other species had done before. This belief, more than anything else, was the true failure of the Threxian Empire. It was not cruelty that doomed them. It was assumption. They assumed humans would behave the way every other species had behaved when faced with Threxian power, with quiet acceptance, perhaps some grumbling, but ultimately, obedience. They did not understand that humans had a long, painful history of resisting exactly this kind of treatment. They did not understand that humans, more than almost any other species in the galaxy, valued personal dignity as something worth fighting for, not because it was logical, but because it was deeply woven into who they were as a people. 10 days after the incident, human military production facilities across every colony and every continent on Earth began operating at levels no one outside the government fully understood yet. Shipyards that normally built commercial vessels quietly received new orders. Research facilities that had been working on defensive technology for years suddenly found their projects fast-tracked and fully funded. None of this was announced publicly. None of this appeared in any Threxian intelligence report. The Empire, confident that the matter was closed, continued its daily operations exactly as before, unaware that somewhere far away, an entire species was quietly preparing for something the Empire had never truly faced in 1,000 years of history, a war against an enemy who did not measure the cost of conflict the way they did, an enemy who was willing to give up comfort, safety, and peace for the sake of something the Empire still did not understand: dignity. And while Threxian officials filed away warnings under minor cultural notes, while their ambassador struggled to explain a position that made less sense each time he repeated it, and while their ruling council focused on rivals they considered more dangerous, the quiet spark lit beside a river on Kes Varn continued to grow, unseen and unwatched by the empire that had lit it. 2 weeks after the incident at Kes Varn, something began happening across human space that had never happened before in the short history of humanity among the stars. It started quietly. A shipyard in orbit above Mars, normally used to build cargo vessels for mining operations, received a sudden change in orders. Instead of freighters, the workers were told to begin assembling frames for something entirely different: warships. Similar changes happened at shipyards above Earth, above the colonies of Titan, and above the newer settlements near Alpha Centauri. At first, only a small number of people understood what was truly happening. Workers were told simple explanations: defense upgrades, new trade agreements, routine expansion of the fleet. But those who paid close attention noticed the scale of what was happening was far beyond routine. General Elena Cross, now working almost without sleep, stood before a private session of the council, this time joined by the leaders of Earth's largest nations, all gathered together for the first time in over a decade. "We are not preparing for a diplomatic protest," she said. "We are preparing for war." Some leaders in the room hesitated. War with an empire that controlled hundreds of star systems seemed impossible to consider. The Threxian Empire had existed for 1,000 years. It had a military built on ancient traditions, endless resources, and countless conquered worlds providing soldiers, ships, and supplies. "How can we possibly stand against them?" asked one nervous minister. "They outnumber us by every measure: ships, soldiers, territory." General Cross did not flinch. "They outnumber us in size," she said, "but they do not understand us, and that will cost them more than they realize." She explained what human intelligence had already discovered. The Threxian military was built on a strict hierarchy, where soldiers followed orders without question, and commanders rarely deviated from established strategy. Their war doctrine, refined over centuries, relied on overwhelming force, applied slowly and carefully, always following the same patterns that had worked for 1,000 years against species who fought predictably, or simply surrendered when faced with superior numbers. Humans did not fight that way. Humanity's entire history was filled with wars fought against larger, stronger enemies. Wars won not through equal strength, but through unconventional thinking, rapid adaptation, and an absolute unwillingness to accept defeat when something important was at stake. And to humans, dignity was something worth any cost. Across Earth, governments that had spent decades arguing over budgets and priorities suddenly found unity in a way that surprised even themselves. Military funding that had been debated for years was approved within days. Old rivalries between nations were set aside, at least for now, as leaders realized that this was no longer a matter of individual countries, but of humanity as a whole facing an outside threat. Factories that once produced cars and machinery were converted to build starship components. University research labs turned their focus toward new weapons technology and improved shielding systems. Programs that had been slowly developing faster-than-light travel and advanced targeting systems for years suddenly received massive funding boosts, cutting years off their expected completion dates. None of this happened through public announcements or grand speeches. It happened quietly, methodically, the way water slowly rises behind a dam before eventually breaking through. Meanwhile, the story of Mia, Sarah, and Priya had become something far larger than the girls themselves ever expected. They had become symbols, whether they wanted to be or not, of everything the coming conflict represented. The three girls had been moved from Kesvarn to a secure facility on Earth for their own safety, given the sudden intense public attention surrounding their case. They were given comfortable housing, careful medical attention, and constant support from counselors trained to help them process what had happened. But nothing could fully prepare them for the strange new reality of being known by nearly every person on the planet. Sarah struggled the most with the public attention. She had always been outgoing, quick to laugh, comfortable in front of others. But now, every time she left her room, people recognized her instantly. Strangers cried when they saw her. Children asked to touch her regrown hair, now just a few centimeters long, as if it were something sacred. She felt as though her pain had become public property, something everyone else now owned a piece of. "I don't want to be a symbol," she confided quietly to Mia one evening. "I just want my hair back. I just want things to be normal again." Mia, always the quieter of the three, had reacted differently to everything happening around them. She spent long hours reading updates about the growing military mobilization, watching news coverage of factories converting to war production, and listening carefully to interviews given by military leaders. Where Sarah felt overwhelmed by public attention, Mia felt a strange, steady determination growing inside her. "They don't understand what they started," Mia said one night, watching a report about new warship designs being tested near Jupiter's orbit. "They thought this was nothing. They thought we would just accept it, the way everyone else always has. But we won't. And I don't think anyone can stop what's coming now, even if they wanted to." Priya remained the quietest of the three, spending much of her time simply sitting near windows, watching the sky, saying very little to anyone outside her close circle of friends and family. Her grandmother, now living with her at the secure facility, gently brushed the short regrowth of Priya's hair each night, the way she used to when Priya was very young. "Hair grows back," her grandmother said softly one evening. "But some things, once broken, take longer to heal. Do not let anger become the only thing you carry, child. Let it become purpose instead." Priya nodded slowly, though she said nothing. She thought carefully about her grandmother's words in the days that followed, eventually finding the courage to speak publicly for the first time since the incident. In a short, quiet interview broadcast across every major network, she said only a few sentences, but they carried enormous weight. "They took something from us because they believed it meant nothing," she said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I hope, in the end, they learn that some things mean everything." Her words spread instantly, repeated in speeches, printed on banners, shared endlessly across every communication network humanity possessed. It became something close to a rallying cry, not because it called for violence, but because it captured exactly what so many people felt, a quiet, unshakable resolve. As the weeks passed, human military strength grew at a pace that surprised even the generals overseeing the effort. New warship designs, based on decades of previously unfunded research, were completed far faster than anyone expected. Advanced targeting systems, artificial intelligence coordination between fleets, and improved shielding technology all moved from theoretical development to active deployment in record time. Beyond military hardware, Humanity also began reaching out to other species across the galaxy, species who had their own grievances against the Threxian Empire, but had never found the courage or strength to act alone. Ambassadors were sent quietly to distant worlds, carrying with them not just diplomatic proposals, but the footage from Kesvarn itself, translated and adapted to resonate with each species' own cultural understanding of dignity and autonomy. Several smaller species, long tired of Threxian dominance but too weak individually to resist, began signaling quiet support for humanity's cause. Some offered resources, others offered strategic information about Threxian fleet movements and weaknesses in their command structure. A few even offered soldiers, eager for the chance to finally stand against an empire that had controlled their lives for generations. None of this activity registered clearly within Threxian intelligence networks. The Empire's outdated assumptions about human weakness, combined with their focus on rivals they considered more significant threats, meant that reports of unusual human activity were consistently downplayed or ignored entirely. By the end of the first month following the incident, humanity's military strength had grown far beyond what the Empire believed possible for a species with such a short history among the stars. Fleets that had barely existed a few weeks earlier now stood ready in orbit above Earth and its colonies. Soldiers who had never expected to fight beyond their own solar system, trained rigorously for combat against an empire whose true strength remained mostly unknown to them. General Elena Cross stood once more before the council, this time delivering a very different kind of report. "Our fleets are ready," she said. "Our alliances with other species are growing, and our people, more united than they have been in generations, stand fully behind this cause." She paused, looking around the room at leaders who, only weeks earlier, had doubted whether humanity could even consider standing against the Threxian Empire. "They believed this was nothing," she continued. "They believed we would forget, the way every other species before us apparently did. But we are not like the others. We remember, and soon, they will understand exactly what that means." Far away, on Threx Prime, life continued exactly as it always had. Reports were filed, meetings were held, and daily operations proceeded without interruption. The ruling council remained focused on their long-standing rivalry with the Corveth Dominion, still believing the human situation to be a minor, resolved matter. They had no way of knowing that, across the galaxy, an entire species had spent the past month quietly preparing for war, driven not by strategic calculation, but by something the Empire had never truly understood: the unwavering belief that dignity, once taken, must be answered for. The spark, ignored and dismissed by the Empire that lit it, had grown into something far larger than anyone on Threx Prime could imagine, and soon, very soon, that fire would finally reach them. The first human fleet arrived at the edge of Threxian territory almost 2 months after the incident at Kesvarn. No formal declaration of war had been issued. There had been no long diplomatic buildup, no series of warnings, no final ultimatum given time to be considered. Humanity had chosen instead to act quickly, using the element of surprise, something Threxian military doctrine had never seriously prepared for. The first target was a mid-sized Threxian outpost near the border, a supply station called Voth Station, responsible for refueling and resupplying patrol ships along the frontier. It was lightly defended, considered unimportant by Threxian command, exactly the kind of location humanity needed to test its new fleet against real Threxian forces for the first time. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. Threxian defense ships, following standard doctrine, formed their traditional defensive formation, a slow, careful pattern designed to allow reinforcements time to arrive while wearing down an attacking force through patience and superior numbers. It was a strategy that had worked for centuries against enemies who fought in predictable, traditional ways. Human ships did not fight that way. Instead of engaging in a slow, methodical battle, the human fleet split into small, fast-moving groups, striking multiple points simultaneously, overwhelming the station's defenses before reinforcements could arrive. Advanced targeting systems, developed rapidly in the weeks following the mobilization, allowed human ships to strike weak points in Threxian shielding with remarkable precision. Within minutes, Voth Station's defenses were disabled, and the station's commander, realizing the situation was hopeless, surrendered rather than face total destruction. It was the first time in nearly 1,000 years that a Threxian military outpost had surrendered to an enemy force. News of the attack reached Threx Prime within hours, causing confusion rather than alarm. Many officials initially assumed it was some kind of mistake, a miscommunication, or perhaps an attack from a rival species attempting to frame humanity. It seemed impossible that the same, young, weak species they had dismissed only weeks earlier could be responsible for such a coordinated, effective military strike. It was only when a second attack occurred 3 days later, this time against a larger Threxian border fleet, that the ruling council finally began to understand the seriousness of the situation. The second battle was far larger than the first. A Threxian fleet of nearly 200 ships, commanded by an experienced officer named Grand Admiral Voss Keller, engaged a human fleet less than half its size, near a border system called Denrath. Voss Keller, confident in the superior numbers of his fleet, expected an easy victory. He was wrong. Human ships, though fewer in number, used tactics that Threxian commanders found deeply unfamiliar. Rather than meeting the larger fleet head-on, human forces used speed and coordination to isolate smaller groups of Threxian ships, overwhelming them before the rest of the fleet could respond. Advanced human artificial intelligence systems coordinated attacks with a level of precision Threxian ships struggled to counter, adjusting strategies in real time based on constantly shifting battle conditions. Perhaps most importantly, human soldiers displayed something Threxian doctrine had never accounted for: a willingness to take significant risks, even accept heavy losses, if it meant achieving a decisive victory. Threxian military culture, built on rigid hierarchy and careful preservation of resources, simply could not match this level of aggressive commitment. By the end of the battle, nearly half of Voss Keller's fleet had been destroyed or disabled, while human forces, though damaged, remained largely intact. Voss Keller himself, recognizing the scale of the defeat, retreated his remaining ships rather than risk total annihilation, a decision that would later be heavily criticized by Threxian command, though few could suggest a better alternative given the circumstances. Word of the defeat spread quickly throughout the Empire, causing the first real signs of panic within the ruling council. Emergency sessions were called. Military strategists who had spent their entire careers studying traditional warfare found themselves struggling to understand an enemy that refused to follow any of the patterns they had relied upon for centuries. "They fight without fear," Voss Keller reported grimly during a private briefing with council leaders. "They accept losses that our own soldiers would never accept. They move faster than our formations can adjust to. And worst of all, they seem completely unwilling to consider surrender, regardless of the odds against them." One council member, clearly frustrated, asked the question many others were thinking: how is this possible? They are a young species. They should not have this level of military capability. Voss Keller did not have a clear answer, but a quiet voice from the back of the room offered one instead. It was Onu Vess, the Velkari diplomat who had sent his earlier warning about human emotional triggers, now called before the council to explain his previous observations. "I warned of this months ago," he said carefully. "Humans do not calculate the cost of conflict the way we do. When something is taken from them that they consider deeply personal, especially something tied to dignity or identity, they do not respond with proportional anger. They respond with total commitment. I believe what we are witnessing now is the direct result of the incident at Kesvarn." The council fell into stunned silence. Many had genuinely forgotten about the incident entirely, dismissing it months earlier as an unimportant administrative matter. Only now did they begin to understand the true scale of the mistake made by a single mid-level officer and the administrators who had ignored the warnings that followed. Meanwhile, humanity's military campaign continued to expand. Encouraged by early victories and supported by newly formed alliances with smaller species eager to see the Threxian Empire weakened, human forces began pushing further into Threxian territory, targeting supply lines, communication relays, and lightly defended outposts throughout the border regions. Other species that had quietly supported humanity's cause began openly joining the effort, no longer willing to hide their involvement now that the Empire's vulnerability had been clearly exposed. Fleets from smaller, previously subjugated species joined human forces, contributing ships, soldiers, and critical knowledge of Threxian defensive weaknesses gathered over generations of quiet resentment. The war, once considered impossible by Threxian leadership, quickly became a genuine crisis threatening the stability of the entire empire. Back on Earth, the war effort continued to be supported by an overwhelming sense of unity among the human population. Despite the dangers and losses involved, public support for the conflict remained remarkably strong. Military recruitment centers across every continent saw record numbers of volunteers. Factories operated around the clock, producing ships, weapons, and supplies at a pace unmatched in human history. Mia, Sarah, and Priya, still recovering from their own personal trauma, found themselves increasingly involved in supporting the war effort, though in different ways suited to their individual strengths and comfort levels. Mia, driven by her quiet determination, volunteered to work directly with military coordination teams, using her sharp analytical mind to help process incoming reports from the front lines. She rarely spoke publicly about her role, preferring instead to focus entirely on the practical work in front of her. Sarah, despite her earlier discomfort with public attention, eventually found purpose in speaking directly to soldiers preparing for deployment, offering encouragement and reminding them exactly what they were fighting to protect. Her natural warmth and honesty made her a comforting presence among troops facing the uncertainty of war. Priya continued her quiet, thoughtful approach, choosing to work closely with diplomatic teams reaching out to other species, using her calm, careful nature to help build trust with potential allies, still hesitant to fully commit to humanity's cause. Though none of the three girls ever sought to become symbols of the conflict, their continued involvement, each in their own way, became a powerful reminder to both soldiers and civilians alike of exactly why the war had begun and exactly what was at stake. As months passed, the Threxian Empire found itself increasingly unable to respond effectively to humanity's rapid, unpredictable tactics. Traditional Threxian strategy, built on centuries of careful, methodical warfare, simply could not adapt quickly enough to counter an enemy willing to take significant risks in pursuit of decisive victories. Internal tensions within the empire also began to grow. Species previously loyal to Threxian rule, encouraged by humanity's early successes, began quietly questioning their continued loyalty. Some openly rebelled, taking advantage of the empire's weakened military presence along stretched supply lines to reclaim territory lost generations earlier. The ruling council, faced with mounting losses on multiple fronts, found itself divided over how to proceed. Some members argued for immediate, aggressive escalation, believing overwhelming force could still crush human resistance before it grew any further. Others, recognizing the growing instability within the empire itself, quietly began considering the possibility of negotiation, a concept almost unheard of in the empire's thousand-year history of military dominance. Grand Admiral Voss Keller, now leading the empire's primary defensive efforts along the border, found himself increasingly frustrated by the council's indecision. "Every day we delay a unified response," he warned during another tense council session. "The humans grow stronger, and our own allies grow weaker in their loyalty to us. We cannot fight this war using the same strategies that worked against species who valued survival above all else. Humans do not fight the same way. We must adapt, or we will lose control of far more than this border conflict." Despite his warnings, internal disagreements within the council continued to slow the empire's response, allowing humanity and its growing coalition of allies additional time to strengthen their position even further. Far behind the front lines, on Earth, General Elena Cross received regular updates on the war's progress, each report reinforcing her earlier warning to the council, months before the conflict had even begun. "They believed this would be simple," she said quietly to her senior staff, reviewing the latest battle reports. "They believed a single act of disrespect could be forgotten within hours. They never understood the price of underestimating what dignity truly means to us." As the war continued to escalate, it became increasingly clear to observers across the galaxy that the Threxian Empire, once considered nearly unshakable after 1,000 years of dominance, now faced a genuine threat to its continued existence. Not from a rival empire built on comparable strength, but from a young, determined species who had simply refused to accept being treated as less than human. Nearly a year after the incident at Kesvarn, the war that no one on Threx Prime had believed possible finally reached its end. It did not end with a single dramatic battle, the kind often imagined in old stories of galactic conquest. Instead, it ended slowly, through a combination of military defeat, internal rebellion, and the quiet collapse of the loyalty that had held the Threxian Empire together for 1,000 years. By the final months of the conflict, the Empire found itself fighting on too many fronts at once. Human forces, supported by an increasingly confident coalition of smaller allied species, had pushed deep into what was once considered secure Threxian territory. Meanwhile, species long dissatisfied with Threxian rule took advantage of the Empire's weakened military presence to openly rebel, reclaiming worlds and resources that had been under Threxian control for generations. The ruling council, once united under centuries of unquestioned authority, became increasingly divided. Some members continued to argue for a final, desperate military effort, believing the Empire's remaining strength could still turn the tide of the war. Others, recognizing the impossible position the Empire now faced, quietly began reaching out through neutral channels, seeking a way to end the conflict before total collapse became unavoidable. It was Grand Admiral Voss Keller himself, now widely respected despite his earlier defeats, who eventually convinced the Council that continued resistance would only lead to greater destruction. "We built our strength on the assumption that our enemies would always fight the way we expected them to," he told the Council during their final formal session. "Humanity taught us otherwise. Their strength was never simply in their ships or their weapons. It was in their absolute refusal to accept being treated without dignity. As long as this war continues, that same strength will only grow stronger, drawing more allies to their cause and further weakening our control over what remains of this empire." Reluctantly, the Council agreed to formally request peace negotiations with humanity and its allies. The negotiations, held aboard a neutral space station chosen specifically because it belonged to neither empire, lasted nearly 3 weeks. Human representatives, led personally by General Elena Cross, made their position clear from the very beginning. This war was never about territory or resources, she told the Threxian delegation during the opening session. It began because your empire treated 3 young human girls as though their dignity meant nothing. Any peace agreement must reflect a clear understanding that such treatment will never again be acceptable, not toward humanity, and not toward any other species under your influence. The Threxian delegation, led by a newly appointed diplomat named Kale Sareth, chosen specifically for his willingness to acknowledge past mistakes, responded carefully. "The Empire acknowledges that its previous handling of the incident at Kesvarn was a serious failure," he said. "We understand now, though painfully late, that our assumptions about your species were both inaccurate and deeply disrespectful. We are prepared to accept meaningful terms to ensure such a failure is never repeated." The final peace agreement, eventually signed by both human and Threxian representatives, included several significant terms. The Empire agreed to full reparations for the war's damages, both to humanity and to the smaller allied species who had joined the conflict. More importantly, the Empire agreed to a complete restructuring of its interactions with other species, replacing the old, rigid biometric registration system with a new framework requiring full consent and cultural sensitivity for any procedures involving another species' body or personal identity. Perhaps most symbolically, the Empire agreed to establish a permanent cultural exchange program, ensuring that future generations of Threxian officials would receive thorough education about the customs, values, and sensitivities of the species they interacted with, an idea that would have seemed absurd to the Empire's leadership only a year earlier. Vex Doran, the officer originally responsible for the incident, faced consequences as part of the agreement as well. Though he had simply been following established protocol at the time, the Empire formally acknowledged the harm caused by his actions and issued a personal, direct apology to Mia, Sarah, and Priya, delivered in person at their request, during a private ceremony held shortly after the peace agreement was finalized. Vex Doran, visibly uncomfortable and clearly changed by the events of the past year, stood quietly before the 3 young women who had, without ever intending to, become the reason an entire empire had been forced to change. "I did not understand what I was taking from you that day," he said quietly. "I saw only paperwork, a formality to be completed. I did not see you as people whose feelings mattered. I am deeply sorry for the pain I caused, and for the far greater pain that followed because of my failure to see you clearly." Sarah, now with hair grown back to shoulder length, studied him carefully before responding. "You didn't just take our hair that day," she said. "You took our sense of safety, our trust that we would be treated fairly, simply because we were different from you. I hope you understand now why that mattered so much to us." Mia added quietly, I hope your empire remembers this, not just as a lesson learned through war, but as something that should have been obvious from the very beginning, that every person, no matter their species, deserves to be treated with basic respect. Priya, calmer and more reflective than ever after the long year of conflict, offered the final words of the ceremony. Hair grows back, she said gently, but trust, once broken, takes far longer to heal. I hope your empire spends the coming years proving, through actions and not simply words, that this lesson has truly been learned. The peace agreement, once finalized, marked the beginning of a new era, not just for humanity and the Threxian Empire, but for galactic society as a whole. Smaller species who had long lived under strict Threxian control found themselves granted greater autonomy and respect, encouraged by humanity's insistence that basic dignity be recognized as a fundamental right for all species, regardless of size or military strength. Humanity itself emerged from the conflict forever changed. What had once been a young, uncertain species, viewed by others as weak and inexperienced, was now recognized throughout the galaxy as a determined and formidable presence, not simply because of military strength, but because of a clear demonstration that humans would never quietly accept being treated without basic respect. General Elena Cross, reflecting on the conflict during a private conversation with her senior staff many months after the peace agreement was signed, offered a simple, quiet observation. They believed our strength would be measured by size, by resources, by how easily we could be controlled, she said. They never understood that our true strength was something far simpler. We refused to accept being treated as less than we are, no matter the cost required to prove it. As for Mia, Sarah, and Priya, life slowly returned to something resembling normal, though none of them would ever be quite the same as they were before that quiet morning by the river on Kesvarn. Their hair, once shaved without permission, had long since grown back, each choosing to style it differently, as a quiet, personal statement of reclaiming their own identity. Mia eventually pursued further education in strategic analysis, using the skills she had developed during the war to help build new diplomatic frameworks designed to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. Sarah found herself drawn toward counseling work, helping other young people who had experienced trauma find their own path toward healing and strength, understanding personally the difficult journey from victim to symbol to, finally, simply herself again. Priya, perhaps most quietly transformed of the three, became deeply involved in cross-species diplomatic efforts, working carefully to build genuine understanding between different cultures, determined to ensure that misunderstandings born from ignorance would never again be allowed to grow into full-scale conflict. Years later, when asked by a young journalist how she felt about being remembered as one of the three girls whose experience had sparked humanity's first major interstellar war, Priya considered the question carefully before answering. "I never wanted to be a symbol," she said. "I only wanted to be seen as a person, with feelings and dignity worth respecting. If our experience taught the galaxy anything, I hope it is simply this. No one, regardless of species, size, or power, should ever be made to feel as though their identity means nothing to those who hold power over them." She paused, looking toward the sky, much as she had done on that quiet, painful morning so many years before. "The Empire believed our hair meant nothing," she continued softly. "They never understood that for us, it was never really about hair at all. It was about being seen, being respected, and being treated as something more than simply another item to be processed and forgotten." And so, what had begun as a small, careless act beside a quiet river on a distant colony world had, in the end, changed not only the fate of an entire empire, but the way an entire galaxy understood the true meaning of dignity, respect, and the quiet, unbreakable strength found in refusing to be treated as less than what you truly are. The war was over, the empire had changed, and three young women, once dismissed as unimportant by a power that ruled 1,000 worlds, had proven, in the end, that some things, no matter how small they might seem to those in power, truly do mean everything.